When Michael Jordan sat down in that fancy Manhattan office with a $100 million contract right in front of him, everyone in the room thought they knew exactly what was about to happen. The pen was in his hand. The deal was perfect. His lawyers had checked every single page and said, yes, this is it, sign it now. But then Michael did something that shocked every single person sitting at that table. He put the pen down, closed the contract, and walked out the door, leaving all that money behind. And the reason why? Well, nobody saw it coming because it started years ago with a school custodian that most people never even noticed. The conference room on the 47th floor of the Pinnacle Tower in Manhattan gleamed with the kind of wealth that most people only glimpsed in movies, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that stretched all the way to the horizon, where steel and glass surrendered to sky. Michael Jordan sat at the far end of an obsidian table so polished it reflected the faces of everyone gathered there like a dark mirror, his hands folded calmly in front of him, while attorneys shuffled papers and executives from Meridian Sports International exchanged nervous glances that spoke volumes about how much this meeting mattered to them. The deal on the table represented $100 million, a figure that would have made most men dizzy with anticipation, but Michael's expression remained unreadable, his jaw set in that familiar way that had once struck fear into opponents who knew that look meant he was about to do something extraordinary. Reginald Thornton, the silver-haired CEO of Meridian, leaned forward with a smile that revealed teeth too white to be natural, his Rolex catching the afternoon light as he gestured toward the leather-bound contract that sat between them like a treasure map, promising riches beyond imagination. The room smelled of expensive cologne and fresh coffee, the kind that cost more per pound than most people spent on groceries in a month. And somewhere in the building below, the city hummed with the energy of 8 million people who had no idea that in this room, a deal worth more than most of them would earn in 10 lifetimes was about to either happen or fall apart. Michael picked up the Mont Blanc pen that had been placed before him, its weight substantial in his hand. And for a moment everyone in the room held their breath, because they all knew that when Michael Jordan made a decision, it was final, absolute, and nothing on earth could change his mind. The journey to this moment had begun 6 months earlier when Theodore Kensington, Meridian's vice president of global partnerships, had first approached Michael's team with a proposition that seemed too good to be true. Meridian wanted to create an entirely new line of athletic footwear and apparel that would compete with the biggest names in the industry, and they wanted Michael's name, his image, his legend, to be the cornerstone of this empire they planned to build. The money they offered was staggering, not just the $100 million upfront, but percentages of sales that could potentially double or triple that amount over the life of the contract. And they were willing to give Michael creative control, final say on design, the kind of artistic freedom that most athletes never received in these kinds of arrangements. Theodore had flown to Charlotte personally, showing up at Michael's office with presentations that filled 3 laptops and a confidence that suggested he believed this deal was already done before the first word was spoken. But Michael had learned long ago that the best deals were the ones you walked away from if something didn't feel right. A lesson that had been taught to him not by agents or business managers, but by a man named Walter Briggs, someone the world had never heard of, but who had shaped Michael's understanding of worth and value in ways that went deeper than any contract could measure. Walter had been the custodian at Laney High School in Wilmington, North Carolina, back when Michael was just a kid trying to make the varsity basketball team, a quiet man with hands calloused from years of hard work, who mopped floors and fixed broken desks and never complained about the teenagers who tracked mud through the hallways or left trash in the gymnasium. Most students barely noticed Walter, treating him like part of the furniture. But Michael had seen something in the older man's eyes, a dignity that had nothing to do with job titles or paychecks, and they had struck up an unlikely friendship that lasted through Michael's high school years and beyond. Walter had grown up in rural Virginia during a time when opportunities for black men were limited by laws that shouldn't have existed, and prejudices that ran so deep they poisoned entire communities. But he had raised 5 children on his custodian salary, put 3 of them through college, and somehow managed to save enough money to buy a small house that he owned free and clear by the time he was 50. Michael used to stay after practice sometimes, helping Walter push the big dust mops across the gym floor. And during those quiet hours when the school was empty and the only sound was the squeak of sneakers on hardwood, Walter would share stories about his life, lessons about integrity and self-respect that had nothing to do with basketball but everything to do with becoming a man. One story in particular had stayed with Michael through all the years, all the championships, all the endorsement deals and business ventures that followed. A story that Walter had told him during Michael's senior year, when college scouts were starting to take notice and the future was beginning to look very different from anything Michael had imagined. Walter's oldest son, Marcus, had been offered a job at a manufacturing plant in Richmond when he graduated from college with an engineering degree, a position that came with a good salary and benefits and the promise of advancement, but there had been a condition that the hiring manager had mentioned almost casually during the final interview. The plant had a policy, unwritten but understood, that black employees could work in certain departments but not others, could advance to certain levels but no higher, and while the manager assured Marcus that he would be treated fairly within those boundaries, everyone knew what those boundaries really meant. Marcus had walked out of that interview and called his father from a payphone outside the plant, and Walter had listened to his son's anger and frustration and disappointment before saying something that Michael would never forget, because Walter repeated it to him years later when they were pushing those dust mops across the gym floor together. "Some deals cost more than the price they're asking," Walter had said, his voice quiet but firm in the way it got when he was saying something important. "They might be offering you money, but they're asking you to sell something that you can't ever buy back. Your dignity, your self-respect, your sense of who you are in the world. Once you sell those things, son, no amount of money can make you whole again." Marcus had turned down that job and eventually found another position at a smaller company that paid less, but treated him like the talented engineer he was, and he had built a career that made him proud, something that Walter said was worth more than any paycheck could measure. Michael had been 17 when he heard that story, young enough to think that money was the answer to everything, but something about Walter's words had planted themselves in his mind like seeds that would take years to grow into understanding. Now, sitting in this gleaming conference room with $100 million deal in front of him, Michael found himself thinking about Walter, who had passed away 15 years earlier, his funeral attended by hundreds of former students who had finally understood what an extraordinary man had walked among them. The contract before Michael was 47 pages of legal language that his attorneys had already reviewed and approved, finding nothing unusual or concerning in the terms, and Meridian had agreed to every request his team had made, every condition they had proposed. The creative control was real, the percentages were generous, and the upfront payment was structured in a way that protected Michael's interests, while giving Meridian the security they needed to move forward. By any objective measure, this was an exceptional deal, the kind that business schools would teach as a case study in successful negotiations, and yet Michael had felt something nagging at him for weeks now, a discomfort he couldn't quite name or explain. The feeling had started small, barely noticeable during his third meeting with Theodore and the Meridian executive team at their headquarters in Los Angeles. They had been discussing the marketing strategy for the new line, how they planned to position it in the market, the demographics they were targeting, and someone had made a comment about keeping the messaging accessible to their core audience. The word had hung in the air for just a moment, and Michael had asked what they meant by accessible, and there had been a pause, the kind of uncomfortable silence that speaks louder than any words, before Theodore had smoothly redirected the conversation to talk about athlete endorsements and social media campaigns. Michael had let it go at the time, telling himself he was being oversensitive, but the moment had stuck with him, a splinter under the skin that he couldn't quite remove. At a dinner the following month in Chicago, where Meridian had flown Michael and his closest advisors to meet with their board of directors, Michael had sat next to a woman named Victoria Hastings, the company's chief marketing officer, who had spent 20 years building brands for Fortune 5. She was sharp and articulate, with a kind of confidence that came from knowing she was good at what she did, and over appetizers that cost more than Walter Briggs had probably spent on food in a month. She had outlined her vision for the campaign. They would position Michael not just as an athlete, but as a symbol of achievement, she explained. Someone who had transcended his background to reach the pinnacle of success. And they would use his story to inspire their customers to believe they too could overcome any obstacle. It all sounded wonderful, the kind of aspirational messaging that advertisers loved. But Michael had noticed something in the way Victoria phrased certain things, a subtle implication that his background was something that needed to be transcended rather than celebrated. But his success was remarkable not because of who he was, but in spite of where he came from. Michael's closest friend, Lawrence Chambers, who had known him since their days at the University of North Carolina, and now served as one of his business advisors, had pulled him aside after that dinner and asked if he had noticed anything odd about the conversation. Lawrence had picked up on the same undercurrent Michael had felt, a sense that Meridian saw Michael's story as something to be managed and massaged rather than honored and respected. They stood outside the restaurant smoking cigars that Michael's father would have approved of, the Chicago wind whipping around them, and Lawrence said something that crystallized the unease Michael had been feeling. "They're not buying partnership with Michael Jordan," Lawrence said, his breath visible in the cold air. "They're buying the right to shape who Michael Jordan is in their advertisements, and I'm not sure those two things are the same." The weeks that followed had been filled with conference calls and revised proposals, with Meridian's team working overtime to address concerns that Michael's attorneys raised about language and terms. But beneath all the legal discussions and contractual negotiations, Michael was grappling with something that had nothing to do with money or percentages or creative control. He kept thinking about Walter Briggs, about that story of Marcus turning down the job in Richmond, about the price of selling something that couldn't be bought back. Late at night in his home office, Michael would look at the framed photograph he kept on his desk. A picture of himself as a high school senior standing next to Walter in the Laney High School gym, both of them smiling. Michael in his basketball uniform and Walter in his custodian's coveralls, and he would wonder what Walter would say about this Meridian deal. Sylvia Chen, the lead attorney from the firm representing Michael in this negotiation, had called him 2 weeks before this final meeting in Manhattan to say that Meridian had agreed to every single change they had requested. The contract was now as favorable as any endorsement deal she had ever seen in her 30 years of practice. She told him, and if he signed it today, he would be set up for generational wealth that would benefit not just him but his children and grandchildren. Sylvia was a brilliant lawyer who had negotiated deals for some of the biggest names in sports and entertainment, and she genuinely believed that walking away from this opportunity would be a mistake Michael would regret for the rest of his life. But Sylvia hadn't known Walter Briggs, hadn't heard those stories about dignity and self-respect, hadn't learned the lessons that Michael had absorbed while pushing a dust mop across a high school gym floor. Michael had done something then that surprised even himself, calling a man named Isaiah Washington, who had taught history at Laney High School back when Michael was a student there. Isaiah was retired now, living in Florida, but he and Walter had been close friends, and Michael thought that maybe Isaiah could help him understand what he was feeling. They talked for 2 hours that evening, and Isaiah shared stories about Walter that Michael had never heard, including one about a time when Walter had been offered a promotion to become the school's facilities manager, a job that would have doubled his salary and moved him into an office instead of pushing a mop. Walter had turned it down, Isaiah explained, because the position would have required him to fire 2 other custodians to meet budget cuts, and Walter had refused to build his advancement on the backs of people who depended on their jobs to feed their families. Walter used to say that every choice we make is a reflection of who we are, Isaiah told Michael. Not who we want to be, not who we pretend to be, but who we actually are when the door is closed and nobody's watching. That conversation had led Michael to start asking different questions about Meridian, not questions about money or contract terms, but questions about the company's values and culture, about how they treated their employees and what their track record looked like in terms of diversity and inclusion. What he discovered troubled him in ways he couldn't ignore. Meridian had a workforce that was overwhelmingly white at the executive level, despite operating in an industry that made its profits largely from the talents and images of black athletes. They had been involved in 2 lawsuits in the past 5 years, both settled quietly, from employees who claimed they had been passed over for promotions due to their race. The company's charitable giving, which they had highlighted extensively in their presentations to Michael, focused almost exclusively on causes that benefited wealthy communities rather than the kinds of underserved neighborhoods where Michael had grown up. Devon Martinez, a young investigative journalist who Michael had hired to do research on Meridian, had uncovered something even more troubling. 3 years earlier, the company had shut down a manufacturing facility in North Carolina, laying off 200 workers, most of them black women who had been with the company for decades, and moved the production to a facility overseas where they could pay workers a fraction of what they had been paying in the United States. When community leaders had protested, Meridian's public relations team had issued a statement about global competitiveness and market pressures, but they had never acknowledged the lives they had disrupted or offered any assistance to the workers who suddenly found themselves unemployed in a town where jobs were scarce. Devon had tracked down several of those former employees, women like Lorraine Baker, who had worked at the facility for 18 years and had been 2 years away from qualifying for her pension when the plant closed, and their stories had made Michael physically sick to his stomach. Lorraine had 3 children, 2 in high school and 1 in middle school, and she had been counting on that pension to help pay for their college educations. When the plant closed, she had to take a job at a grocery store, making $9 an hour, and she eventually lost her house, moving her family into a 2-bedroom apartment where her daughter had to sleep on the couch. Michael had called Lorraine personally, something Devon had tried to talk him out of because it might complicate the business negotiations, and they had spoken for 40 minutes about her life and her struggles and her hopes for her children. She never asked Michael for anything, never complained about Meridian, or tried to use his sympathy to her advantage, but she said something toward the end of their conversation that hit him like a punch to the chest. "My supervisor used to tell us that we were family," Lorraine said, her voice thick with emotion. "She said the company valued us and appreciated our hard work. I believed her, Mr. Jordan. I really did, and then one day they just threw us away like we were nothing." Michael had grown up in Wilmington, North Carolina, in a family where money was always tight and his parents worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table and clothes on their children's backs. His father, James Jordan, had been a mechanic and supervisor at General Electric, a man who took immense pride in his work and taught Michael that a person's character was measured not by what they said, but by what they did when they thought nobody was watching. His mother, Dolores, had worked at a bank, and she had been the one who pushed Michael academically, refusing to let him use basketball as an excuse to slack off in school, insisting that education was the foundation on which everything else had to be built. They had sacrificed so much to give Michael and his siblings opportunities they never had, and Michael knew that his success wasn't just his own achievement, but the result of countless people who had invested in him, believed in him, and supported him when he had nothing to offer them in return except his gratitude and determination. The memory of those sacrifices made it impossible for Michael to ignore what he had learned about Meridian. This wasn't just about a business deal anymore. It was about whether he was willing to attach his name and his legacy to a company that treated people like Lorraine Baker as disposable resources rather than human beings with families and dreams and dignity. Michael thought about his father, who had been murdered in 1993 during a robbery, shot while sleeping in his car on the side of a highway, and how deeply that loss had affected him. James Jordan had lived his life with integrity, doing the right thing even when it cost him, and Michael had tried to honor his father's memory by making choices that would have made him proud. Signing a deal with Meridian, taking their $100 million while knowing how they treated their workers, felt like a betrayal of everything his father had taught him. The night before this final meeting in Manhattan, Michael had sat in his hotel room overlooking Central Park and called his mother. Dolores was 83 now, still sharp as ack, and she listened patiently while he explained the situation with Meridian, the money they were offering, and the ethical concerns he had about the company. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that reminded him why she had always been the moral compass of their family. "Baby, I remember when you were about 9 years old, and some boys in the neighborhood wanted you to help them steal candy from the corner store," she said. "They told you it would be easy, that you wouldn't get caught, that everyone did it. And you came home and asked me what you should do, and I told you that every time you make a choice, you're deciding what kind of man you're going to be. This isn't any different. You're asking me for permission to take money from people who hurt other people, and I can't give you that permission because you already know the answer." In the morning, Michael had breakfast with Lawrence and Sylvia, both of whom were still hoping he would sign the contract. They understood his concerns, they said, but they also believed that he could use the platform Meridian was offering to make positive changes, to push the company to do better, to become a force for good within an imperfect system. It was a compelling argument, one that Michael wanted to believe, but he kept coming back to Walter's words about dignity and self-respect, about the things you can't buy back once you've sold them. He thought about Lorraine Baker and her children, about the 200 workers who had been discarded when they were no longer profitable, about Marcus turning down that job in Richmond because the price they were asking was too high. Now, sitting in this conference room with the contract in front of him and the Mont Blanc pen in his hand, Michael made a decision that he knew would shock everyone in the room. He carefully placed the pen back on the table, closed the leather-bound contract, and looked directly at Reginald Thornton with eyes that had stared down the greatest competitors in basketball history and never blinked. The room was so quiet that Michael could hear someone's watch ticking, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the tension that had suddenly filled the space. Reginald's smile faltered, confusion crossing his face as he realized that something was wrong, that this meeting wasn't going to end the way he had anticipated. Theodore Kensington leaned forward, his voice carefully controlled, as he asked if there was a problem with the contract, if there was something they needed to address or revise, and Michael could see the desperation beginning to creep into his expression, because he knew that if this deal fell apart, his career at Meridian was effectively over. The company had invested millions in developing this new line, had built their entire strategy around Michael's involvement, and losing him now would be a catastrophe that would cost jobs and damage reputations and send their stock price plummeting. But Michael had learned long ago that other people's problems couldn't become the reason for him to compromise his principles, that the desperation in someone else's eyes couldn't be allowed to override what he knew was right. "I appreciate everything you've done to make this deal work," Michael said, his voice calm and steady, carrying the authority of someone who had made the biggest shots in the biggest moments and never doubted himself. "I know my team has asked for a lot, and you've been accommodating and professional throughout this entire process, but I can't sign this contract." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Michael watched as the reality of what he was saying settled over the room like a wave, shock and disbelief spreading across faces that had been so confident just moments before. Sylvia touched his arm, A gentle gesture meant to give him a chance to reconsider, to think about what he was about to walk away from, but Michael shook his head slightly, letting her know that his decision was final. Reginald's face had gone pale, the blood draining from his cheeks as the $100 million deal disintegrated in front of him, and his voice came out strained when he asked what Meridian had done wrong, what they could do to fix whatever problem Michael had with the arrangement. Victoria Hastings, sitting halfway down the table, looked like she might cry, and Theodore Kensington had his hand pressed against his forehead as if he had a sudden migraine, the weight of this failure crushing down on him in real time. Michael's own attorneys were exchanging glances that mixed confusion with concern, because they couldn't understand why he would turn down a deal this good, this lucrative, this advantageous in every measurable way. 3 years ago you closed a manufacturing facility in North Carolina, Michael said, his words precise and deliberate. You laid off 200 workers, most of them women who had given decades of their lives to your company, and you moved that production overseas to save money. I've talked to some of those women. I've heard their stories about how they lost their homes, their pensions, their ability to provide for their families. And I've looked at how your company operates, at your leadership structure, at your charitable giving, at the lawsuits that have been filed against you. Everything I've seen tells me that Meridian doesn't value people the same way I was taught to value people, and I can't put my name on a company that treats human beings as disposable. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and oppressive, and Michael could see the calculations happening behind Reginald's eyes, the CEO trying to figure out if this was a negotiation tactic, if Michael was angling for more money or additional concessions, or if he genuinely meant what he was saying. But Michael's expression left no room for misunderstanding. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a statement of values, a line in the sand that couldn't be crossed, no matter how much money was on the table. Theodore started to say something about how the North Carolina closure had been a difficult business decision, how the company had offered severance packages and job placement assistance. But his words sounded hollow even to himself, corporate talking points that crumbled in the face of Michael's moral clarity. I'm sure you had your reasons, Michael said, standing up now, signaling that this meeting was over. I'm sure your accountants and consultants gave you all kinds of data about profit margins and market competitiveness. But I knew a man named Walter Briggs who taught me that some deals cost more than the price they're asking, that there are things you can't sell without losing a part of yourself that you'll never get back. My name means something. My legacy means something, and I won't trade that for any amount of money, not even $100 million. He could see Lawrence nodding slightly, a gesture of respect and understanding, and even Sylvia, who had argued so strongly for him to take this deal, seemed to recognize that Michael was doing something that transcended legal advice or financial calculation. As Michael walked toward the door, leaving behind the contract that would never be signed and the deal that would never be completed, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a sense of relief that came from knowing he had made the right choice even though it was the harder choice. The executives at Meridian sat frozen at their obsidian table, watching their carefully constructed plans collapse, and Michael knew that this decision would have consequences, that it would be analyzed and debated and questioned by business experts and sports analysts who would never understand why anyone would walk away from $100 million. But those people hadn't known Walter Briggs, hadn't learned the lessons that came from pushing a dust mop across a gym floor with a man who understood that dignity couldn't be measured in dollars. In the elevator riding down from the 47th floor, Lawrence put his hand on Michael's shoulder and said simply, "Your father would be proud," and those words meant more to Michael than any endorsement deal ever could. They walked out of the Pinnacle Tower into the Manhattan afternoon, the city swirling around them with its energy and chaos, and Michael thought about Lorraine Baker and her children, about the 200 women who had been thrown away when they were no longer profitable, about Walter's son Marcus walking out of that interview in Richmond because the price they were asking was too high. He thought about his mother's words from the night before, about how every choice was a decision about what kind of man he was going to be, and he knew that this choice, this moment, was one he would never regret, no matter what opportunities he might have lost. The story would leak to the press within days, reporters calling Michael's representatives to ask about the rumored $100 million deal that had fallen through, and there would be speculation about what had gone wrong, theories about money, or control, or personality conflicts between Michael and the Meridian executives. Some articles would praise his principles, others would question his business judgment, and there would be think pieces about whether athletes had an obligation to consider factors beyond money when evaluating endorsement deals. But Michael didn't do interviews about the decision, didn't release statements explaining his reasoning, because he had learned that some things didn't need to be explained to people who couldn't understand them anyway. 6 months after walking out of that conference room, Michael established a foundation dedicated to supporting workers who had been displaced by corporate downsizing, with a special focus on helping women who had lost long-term employment find new opportunities and rebuild their lives. The first person he hired to run the foundation was Lorraine Baker, whose experience and insight would prove invaluable in shaping programs that actually help people rather than just generating positive publicity. He poured money into the foundation, more money than Meridian had offered him in their deal, and he never once mentioned the connection between his decision to walk away from $100 million and his commitment to supporting people like Lorraine. The real reason Michael Jordan walked out of that $100 million deal, the truth that nobody saw coming because it spoke to a part of his character that highlights and championships could never fully reveal, was that he had learned from a custodian named Walter Briggs that dignity was worth more than any contract, that integrity couldn't be compromised for convenience, and that the measure of a man wasn't found in his bank account but in his willingness to do the right thing, even when it cost him everything. Walter had taught him that some prices were too high to pay, that selling your values was a transaction you could never undo, and that the choices you made when nobody was forcing you to do the right thing were the choices that defined who you really were. Michael carried those lessons with him from a high school gymnasium in Willington to the highest levels of business and sports. And when the moment came to put them into practice, when he had to decide between $100 million and the values that had been instilled in him by a man the world had never celebrated, he chose the path that let him look at himself in the mirror without shame, the path that honored the memory of everyone who had sacrificed to help him become who he was, the path that proved he was exactly the man his father had raised him to be, and exactly the man Walter Briggs had believed he could become, and that in the end was worth infinitely more than any amount of money Meridian or anyone else could ever offer. So that's the real story of why Michael Jordan walked away from $100 million, all because a school custodian named Walter Briggs taught him that some things in life matter more than money. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you listening from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart or taught you something about standing up for what's right, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so we can keep spreading kindness and stories that actually matter. There's another incredible story waiting for you on the screen right now. So go ahead and click it, because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next.